at least not in my circles, that the Soviet, Union and the Eastern Bloc was going to collapse, not in say 1977 or even 1981. But because socialism was winning does not translate into democracy. It doesn't mean that every socialist experiment was deeply democratic. And all regimes at the time were being undermined by US imperialism. And in fact, the question of post-liberation democracy in Africa was widely discussed and debated in the 80s and 90s, especially in the face of a kind of hegemonic neoliberal order. So people like Archie Mafeje, writing in the mid-90s, rejected the strategy of workers and peasants taking state power in favor of what he described as a national democratic alliance in which the popular classes hold the balance of power in a state capable of redistribution. That is to say, social democracy. Issa Shivji wrote a prescient article titled Good Governance, Bad Governance, and the Quest for Democracy in Africa, which warned against conflating democracy with social emancipation. All liberal democracy can do, he argued, is create, quote, the conditions for the emancipatory project. And this was especially true given the constraints of Cold War politics, proxy wars, and the tendency to manage social conflict through coups d'etats. And in his article, he recalls the heady days of the 60s and 70s when he was in Tanzania and elsewhere, where there was an assumption that people were the drivers of change as opposed to the state. But here we are living under neoliberal discourse that's turned the popular classes into, as Issa Shivji puts it, into a helpless lump of poor waiting with bowls in their hand to receive poverty reduction funds while the so-called private sector is paraded as a locomotive of development. And that's the logic today. I mean, that was inconceivable 40 years ago, at least in my circles. I mean, I'm sure people were planning this stuff, and they were implementing it, but I wasn't in those circles, just so you know. So constructing poverty as a perennial problem of skills, resources, exclusion from the labor market of the market economy, and not the market economy itself, not capitalism itself, was a vile act of historical erasure. The problem of democracy had shifted from class struggle and power to the absence of liberal culture. That's how some political science talk about it. The absence of a liberal culture, respect for the rule of law, the need for civil training to establish good governance, right? So you can imagine why in the 1980s, South Africa was our greatest hope. It's our greatest hope. Why? Because it was the one place where we were convinced socialism could flourish, okay? Because as Marxists, we're looking for the places where the productive forces are most developed. And on the continent, it was here. And we thought, okay, the development of socialism in South Africa means socialism across the continent, means Africa as a powerhouse of socialism and social democracy. It was a beacon for the whole continent. And that sense of possibility in the early 80s began to dissipate in the late 80s and early 90s. It was not just a matter of like a string of losses, but a combination of seismic shifts, the implications of which were not readily apparent. So think about what was going on. You have the assassination of Thomas Sankara. You have Tiananmen Square. You have the North American Free Trade Agreement. And with that, the response from Chiapas, the popular uprising in Chiapas, a string of wins that turned out to be losses, like the PLO signing the Oslo Agreement. And of course, the collapse of the Soviet Union in the Eastern Bloc. And let me just say on a side note about this, so no matter what we think about the Soviet Union and Eastern Bloc, one thing we have to remember, and China for that matter, under Mao, is that socialist states actually subsidize poorer socialist states. At the outset of perestroika, for example, the Soviets and Eastern Bloc were buying 85% of Cuban exports and paying more than the market price for the sugar. especially sugar. The Soviets also provided 100% of Cuba's oil and oil products, 91% of its fertilizer, 94% of its grain, 70% of its iron, and so forth. Cuba was not obligated to pay back the debt it owed the Soviets. They weren't asking for the money back. But then 1990 happens, and by 1990, Cubans are in debt to the Soviet Union by $28 billion, and now they're asking for the money. So with the collapse of the socialist bloc, that whole kind of welfare state system came to a screeching halt, elevating it because there's other things that could have happened in terms of technology transfer, other kinds of support. But what I'm saying is one of the reasons that some of these countries were able to survive was because they got money and support from socialist countries. That's meaningful. Now, I'm always hesitant to talk about South Africa in South Africa because it's no longer my field of study. It was but this is a topic, and I know that part of the choice of the topic has to do with the fact that next year will be 30 years since the 1994 elections. But there are other important anniversaries to think about. The Native Land Act, 110 years ago. 1973 was a crucial year. You're talking about the 50th anniversary of the UN General Assembly adopting the Convention on the Suppression and Punishment of Crime of Apartheid, the 50th anniversary of the strikes in Durban in 73, the overthrow of Salvador Allende in Chile, the founding of the New Jewel movement in Grenada. That's all 1973. I'm going to talk about a lot of these things. 1983, you had the formation of the UDF, which, may have come about as an expression of popular democracy, but ultimately became the voice of the ANC. 1983 was also, this is also the 40th anniversary of the National Forum, a different united front with the intention of, in the words of Andy Clarno and Salim Valley, building connections between the Black consciousness movement, anti-racist working class organizations, and independent Marxists. So the National Forum first met in June 1983 before the UDF and drafted what became known as the Azanian Manifesto. Let's begin with the Native Land Act of 1913. We all know the Native Land Act and also what came before it. And what it demonstrates, by returning to that in the context of the current crisis, it demonstrates a point that I've been making for a long time, and that is that liberalism, not just neoliberalism, but liberalism has been antithetical to democracy and liberation. Now you're like, what? Liberals are good. I don't think so, okay? We think of liberalism in terms of certain principles: individual liberty, the right of property, freedom of thought, speech, assembly, the rule of law, consent by the governed, limited government as a check against encroachments on individual liberty, the franchise, though keep in mind that the word universal franchise is kind of a mythology. For so long, the franchise is tied to property ownership. But most importantly, liberalism is about market economy. That's what liberalism is about, right? Everything orbits around markets. It is the only institution that's meant to be free. Don't tell me that human beings are meant to be free under liberalism, because certain ones are not. But markets are the only institution meant to be free. The only real freedom that people have is freedom from coercion in liberalism. Liberalism regards state intervention in the economy a coercive power that restricts the economic freedom of individuals. Its definition of liberty places property rights before human freedom and human needs. It's founded on an exclusionary definition of humans, that is, man as white male, that permits various forms of unfree labor, dispossession, and subordination based on difference, that is, race and gender. And for these reasons, slavery and dispossession, colonialism and genocide were never antithetical to liberalism. These things took place under liberalism. Liberal myths about the capacity for liberty and the need to civilize savages and barbarians not only justified enslavement, dispossession, and colonialism, but obscured the violence of dispossession. Therefore, colonial domination, authoritarianism, unfree labor are compatible with liberalism. And the most egregious example is, of course, colonialism. And if you don't believe me, ask Mr. Liberty himself, John Stuart Mill. He writes, despotism is a legitimate mode of government in dealing with barbarians, provided the end be their improvement and the means justified by actually effecting that end. Now, he wasn't even suggesting a transitional phase of slavery or for uncivilized races. And by the way, John Stuart Mill is not banned in Florida, just so you know, okay? And remember, don't forget, like, when the British abolished slavery, you know, they promoted a new form of slavery called coolie labor, Asian contract labor. Contract labor, of course, was practiced right here. This is the place where contract labor reached its apex of a new form of slavery, right? Now, the crushing limits of liberalism apply especially to the land question in South Africa. So I take my lead from Tembeka Waitobi. I'm sorry, forgive me if I'm doing the best I can, you know, I can't even pronounce my children's name, so. And the book is amazing. It's called Land Matters, and he argues for addressing land dispossession well before the 1913 Natives Land Act, well before the Glenn Gray Act, well before even the wars of expansion in the 1870s. And part of the problem is, he argues, is that the ANC and the states' commitment to liberal conceptions of land as property, which includes tying property to political participation in the franchise. So in a liberal framework, something like ancestral lands are illegible. It's hard to actually conceive of what to do with that. The ANC, he argues, never abandoned this notion of land as property and the principles of English law, which is to say, they fought against racial exclusion to buy property, not the restoration of the land to its original inhabitants. And although the Freedom Charter implies a nationalization of subsoil rights, the mines, and large swaths of farmland, there was a kind of promise of just compensation, okay? This land was stolen, straight up. You know, it's not even a secret. And then they're gonna try to buy it back. Okay, 1973. The Durban strikes of 1973 were part of an international strike wave. And I wanna make sure that we see it as an international strike wave in opposition to the global slump and exacerbated by rising oil prices and OPEC. The same period, the US experienced the largest strike wave in its history. Eventually, what happens in Durban, you know the story, led to the formation of FOSATU in 1979. There was splits between so-called workers and populist tendencies. But what I want to suggest is that the strike wave was evidence of an opposition to neoliberal restructuring, which is to say, South Africa was not unique in this respect. It's not as if the apartheid regime of racial capitalism was this unchanging thing since 1948, and it took pressure from the IMF and World Bank to force South Africa toward liberalization. It was already on the path to liberalization before the transition. Whoops, sorry. So the insurgency and neoliberal turn culminated in reforms in the 1980s in which the apartheid regime tried to co-opt black workers by linking partial citizenship to wage work. And there's I quote Franco Barchiesi, as he puts it, black trade unions were legalized and barriers to urban residence for African workers were relaxed. In its quest for legitimacy, the state tried to recast employment as a free and uncoerced contractual relationship regulated uniquely by the impersonal forces of the market. That is to say, the post-liberation regime took that same association of wage labor with citizenship and applied it, like much of the world, right? It continued to tie citizenship to wage work without considering the conditions of labor. And of course, there are grave consequences that you're living with right now. Wage work was cemented as the only path to solve the problem of inequality and the putative source of redistribution. And again, this is all over the globe, the idea of wage labor. Part of the problem was, a particular orientation of COSATU, for example, that embraced the proletariat as, quote, a universal non-racial worker, while the ANC also embraced wage work as a form of discipline, while also pursuing liberalization policies. The result, of course, was structural unemployment, precarious work, housing insecurity, and the further immiseration of the black working class. A situation that, that more work could never resolve. It's impossible. Even full employment can't resolve the deep inequality, and that's not even possible. And yet the ANC not only treats social provisions as handouts and evidence of workers' failure, rather than the failure of the state. It also treats worker resistance, including struggles over water, electricity, housing, land occupations, as pathological when it's directly inimical to the interests of capital. 1983. Now, of course, Neville Alexander saw all this coming. He was, after all, the National Forum's main intellectual force and was responsible for much of the analysis undergirding the Azania Manifesto. He had argued for a broad, black working class-led alliance in the Sturman document in 1982, and he reminds us that the National Forum not only preceded the UDF, but its initial participants included Alan Bozak and Bishop Tutu. So in other words, it was open to everybody. But once the UDF started, they never went back. Bishop Tutu went back, but not Alan Bozak. The Azanian Manifesto argued that, quote, only the eradication of racial capitalism can put an end to apartheid. The struggle ahead, therefore, was for socialism, right? And he described this where the interests of workers shall be paramount through worker control of the means of production, distribution, and exchange. And the land and all that belongs to it shall be wholly owned and controlled by the people of Azania. And in contrast to the Freedom Charter, there's a line that I think is worth remembering and noting. It reads, the usage of the land and all that accrues to it shall be aimed at ending all exploitation, which is a revision of what the Freedom Charter says. The struggle for a socialist republic was not to take place in some indeterminate future, but right at the moment, right? The driving force, they argued, and Neville argued, it has to be the black working class, broadly defined to include the urban and rural poor in alliance with radical elements of the petty bourgeoisie. The manifesto departed from the idea of a non-racial universal proletariat by identifying the ruling bloc as, quote, a small minority of white capitalists and their allies, the white workers and the reactionary sections of the middle classes. Now, the representation of the National Forum as an insignificant sectarian faction, so many books that don't even mention it, is not only wrong, but it erases the rather treacherous role that some in the UDF and the ANC played in attacking AZAPO and the National Forum, especially by 1985, when the UDF ceased to cooperate with the National Forum and position itself as the sole representative of the liberation movement. Neville Alexander charted a path forward in 1992 that had sort of three elements. One, continue the class struggle through demands for social reforms that benefit oppressed classes. That is, basic reforms, living wage, houses for all, free national health service, free education, jobs for all. Secondly, fight for the radical democratization at every single level. And three, internationalize the struggle. That is solidarity with anti-capitalist and anti-imperialist forces around the world. Now, his longer-term vision for new liberation movements was not regional blocs a la, BRICS, to attract foreign investment, but Pan-African unity, quote, based upon the struggle against those material conditions that hold the people of the continent in bondage. In this way, the people themselves the urban and especially the rural poor will become involved directly in their own liberation. Unity cannot simply be forged in the drawing rooms or conference halls or in the corridors of power more generally. And so his vision was really quite radical. So he called for a continental-wide agreement to become a nuclear-free zone, that is, no nuclear weapons on the continent, and to destroy all offensive weapons, right? By rendering war illegal, it leaves diplomacy and negotiations the only option, and of course it would have made coups less likely. It would have also ended victims of war, and an end to wasting valuable foreign exchange on weapons. He also focused on ecological preservation, especially desertification, and the focus on health, especially fighting HIV/AIDS. Now let me step back for a minute and make a little detour. But get to the last part. And that is, what were the models of socialist democracy at the time, especially in the global South? Clearly, what you saw in South Africa had some echoes of the Cuban Revolution. Chile, Vietnam, and other places resonated in some circles. And like I said, the late 70s, early 80s, it appeared that socialism was winning. So let me make this detour and talk about two intersecting movements, revolutionary movements, that is Guyana and Grenada. In 1974, Walter Rodney returns from Tanzania, which is his birthplace, in Guyana, and comes back to Guyana. He was going to head the history department at the University of Guyana, but the president, Forbes Burnham, basically had his appointment rescinded. Burnham knew that Rodney was there in part to contest power. And in fact, that same year, he was a co-founder of the Working People's Alliance. It was not a cadre organization, but a mass-based, multiracial political movement that mobilized Afro and Indo-Guyanese, as well as indigenous groups. The two major parties in the country were divided along racial lines. So you had Cheddi Jagan, who was, headed the People's Progressive Party and had a substantial South Asian base. Forbes Burnham headed the People's National Congress, which was predominantly black. And Jagan was a communist, Burnham a social democrat. And of course, Burnham becomes prime minister in 1964. In 1970, he declares his country a, quote, cooperative socialist republic and began developing ties with Cuba and the Soviet Union. But Forbes Burnham always had the backing of the United States, right? Always. So Walter called Burnham a pseudo-socialist, which is really, that's like talking about someone's mama. It's the worst thing you could say. Which promoted, policies. Burnham, and he mentioned Michael Manley as well, promoted policies of nationalization, state repression, and racial divisions as a means of consolidating power. And so Rodney argued that workers' democracy was a precondition in the struggle for socialism in the Third World. And he sharply criticized undemocratic practices of Marxist regimes at the time. He came after the People's Republic of the Congo, Congo-Brazzaville, Ethiopia, Somalia, Guinea under Sékou Touré. And again, he was willing to criticize these Marxist regimes for lack of democracy. In 1978, the Working People's Alliance challenged Burnham's pseudo-socialism by opposing a referendum that would have allowed the government to change the Constitution with only 2/3 majority in the National Assembly and therefore bypass the referendum process. And of course, the WPA defeated Burnham, and so Burnham hated, he already had antipathy for Rodney and for WPA as it is. So 1979, the WPA declares the 79 the year of the turn, by which they meant the turn from dictatorship over the masses to democracy of the masses. In that year, if you remember, for those of you who remember or read books, it was the year of the revolution in Nicaragua, Iran, the islands of St. Lucia, Dominica, St. Vincent, and of course the New Jewel movement in Grenada, which overthrew Eric Gary's regime in 1979. Now, the Grenada Revolution is something I think we have to study. We have a lot of romance around it. It emboldened the WPA to take on Burnham's regime, but it was a mixed bag since Maurice Bishop and the New Jewel movement were close allies of Burnham. Still, that same year, the WPA officially became a political party, a cadre organization, and called for the overthrow of Forbes Burnham. Now, Grenada was essentially a left petty bourgeois seizure of power against a dictatorial regime. And it's ironic because Gary himself, who had been in power since 1951, had implemented some redistributive policies like land reform, but he became more concerned with consolidating power and did the same thing that the Duvalier regime did in Haiti, and that is form a special police force and use terror to crush any sign of opposition. He called this the Mongoose Gang. But similar to Black consciousness here in South Africa, an emerging Black power movement made up of unemployed youth and middle-class professionals took off in 1970, inspired by workers and student rebellion in Trinidad that same year. And Gary then declared a state of emergency. And what happened in response? Well, the nurses, because nurses are always at the forefront, by the way. Nurses are the most militant workers you can find. Pay attention. So they basically respond with a mass demonstration in November 1970. The New Jewel movement was formed in 1973, and the following year, Grenada experienced a genuine mass mobilization against the regime in response to declining economic conditions caused by the global slump. Now, here's a lesson. The New Jewel movement was a kind of ideological mixture of Black power, C.L.R. Jamesian Marxism, and some Leninism. And long story short, the 1974 insurgency was the only time that there was a real mass movement, a mass insurgency, mass involvement. But Gary defeated it through sheer force. The following year, Bernard Cord, childhood friend of Bishop, critiqued the New Jewel movement for not building an independent working class organization. The NJM remade itself as a cadre organization, and it became more exclusive, more clandestine, less democratic, and did not create any corresponding mass organization. It didn't do that. So in 1979, when they seized power, they had like 16 guns, right? It's an island of 100,000 people. They seized power, and they kind of abandoned the party structure of James. In fact, didn't create any kind of working class self-organization and tried to make the revolution from the top down. And as Brian Meeks argued, the New Jewel movement rejected democracy, quote, in favor of entrenched paternalism and authoritarianism. And this made them vulnerable to the US-backed counterinsurgency campaign. They created a newspaper, they supported an opposition party with funds. There were internal tensions from the beginning over leadership, and Bernard Cord resigned in 1982 when a group of People's Revolutionary Army arrested Bishop and ultimately killed him along with several other members of the party. The party only had about 50 core members at the time. And this, of course, triggered what? The US invasion of Grenada in 1983. Now, the 4 years that the New Jewel movement was in power, the results are mixed. On one hand, the economy grew and unemployment fell, and not because they were transitioning to socialism, but because of tourism. That was the plan of the New Jewel movement, to advance tourism. And because they were receiving a lot of loans to pay for a new airport it was building with Cuban assistance. Oh, there's another reason why they actually saved money. There was no corruption. It saves money. I wouldn't make that up. I mean, no matter what you think about New Jewel, there was no corruption. Anyway, they failed to diversify agriculture. The main exports were nutmeg, cocoa, bananas. But they were able to finance social programs, health, education, housing, thanks to $168 million in grants and loans from where? Cuba, Soviet Union, Libya, as well as Canada and the UK. But it didn't last. Tourism didn't take off. in part because the airport was still unfinished. OPEC countries promised these loans that never came through, and the result was austerity, layoffs, shortages, cuts in subsidies, and most importantly, no popular involvement in governing. There was no investment in or sacrifice. There was only anger and confusion. And the other problem is that those who were cadre in the New Deal movement were overworked. Many of them were women on whose shoulders the party's work always fell. And so the physical toll was so much that, plus unemployment numbers going up again, people just kind of abandoned the party. No mass base. So Walter Rodney, and another leading light in WPA, Undaye, watched from a distance. And they'd always been critical of Maurice Bishop because he dismissed press freedoms and notions of parliament as bourgeois rights. Undaye observed the decline of mass organizations in Grenada, including women's organizations, under Bishop, which she attributed to the anti-democratic character of Marxist-Leninist cadre parties. So as early as 1982, elements of the Caribbean left had begun to break with Maurice Bishop in the New Deal movement, but they did so quietly. And part of it because they saw the writing on the wall, and the WPA actually abandoned its plans to form its own cadre organization as a result. So whether this is a good idea, cadre organization or not, you all could debate that. That's not my debate. But let me end this discussion with two observations. One, the fact that Forbes Burnham supported Maurice Bishop in the New Deal movement and even provided their cadre members with military training had the effect of suppressing criticism of Grenada and the Grenadian Revolution among the Caribbean left, including the WPA, which withheld its own public criticism of fear of splitting the ranks and undermining the revolution and opening the door to US invasion. Well, it didn't stop the invasion, but people didn't want to criticize the New Deal movement. And I came up, again, in political circles where Maurice Bishop was very heroic. Rodney, of course, didn't live long enough to see the tragic ending of the revolution because Burnham had him assassinated in 1980, which says a lot about Rodney's prescient critique because this is only months after the New Deal movement took power. So in 1979, the WPA did mount a popular insurgency against Burnham. Strikes erupted across the country, mainly bauxite workers, sugar industry. Rodney gave a very powerful speech called People's Power, No Dictator, which the WPA turned into a pamphlet and issued in October 1979. He exposed Burnham's cooperative republic as a farce, a brutal dictatorship in socialist clothes, absent any credibility or legitimacy, and he charged the regime with abrogating all the basic rights for which the generations of Guyanese working people fought. He called for non-cooperation, civil disobedience, national unity, and what they got was brutal suppression. Now, Rodney's death, which I'm not going to talk about, and the crushing of the WPA was not the end of the story. Burnham shored up his dictatorial powers with changes to the Constitution, again, in the name of socialism, and used state ownership to retain control of everything, including the media. His policies drove the economy into the ground, and the imposition of austerity drove masses of Guyanese out of the country. Yet, although Burnham wasn't overthrown, he died in office in 1985, mass democratic rebellion made the country ungovernable. Only the iron fist kept the regime afloat. And Rodney understood that taking power was not on the horizon, so as long as Burnham was able to maneuver behind the cover of what had begun to appear as a dying old left. In fact, Rodney knew something that Maurice Bishop did not know, or apparently did not know. That is, the masses are the driver of revolution, not the party. The masses are the driver of revolution, not the party. And their energies require the oxygen of radical democracy. Okay, so the last thing is, thinking about socialist democracy, right? Finally, oh good, I'm on time. If socialist democracy is indeed a practice, a way of mobilizing people, a space for education, a space to build power and to wage love, and to fight all manner of exploitation, then socialist democracy as a practice is actually alive and well here in this country. But socialist democracy is also, prefigurative. It is anticipatory. It's improvisational. It's deliberative. And I think this is important because we often think about socialism and democracy in terms of policies implemented by the state. But it really is a practice, and it can only exist in practice. And there are many examples. In the best practices of the Fees Must Fall campaign and the demands to decolonize and liberate education, that is socialist democracy at work. Women of crossroads that Coney Benson writes about so eloquently, the courageous and militant women who for decades stood at the forefront of struggles against displacement, slum clearance, poverty, and the attack on the commons. That is socialist democracy in practice. In some of the movements that Trevor Ngwane, in his new book, it's a brilliant book, Amakomiti, Grassroots Democracy in South African Shack Settlements, which makes a persuasive case for the power of self-organized shack dwellers as a political force against market fundamentalism, privatized, commodified land through land occupations. And now neither authors actually are romantic about these struggles of the housing insecure, nor do these organizations always reflect socialist dreams. But if anyone says that the working class is not organized, I would think again, because part of it is what's the definition of the working class? In any country or formation where the unemployment rate basically constitutes half the working class, then the unemployed are the working class, okay? And of course, we've seen examples of socialist democracy at work in Abakali Base Mundanjoro. I was there, I'll say it again. So their call for socialism is explicit, like adopting Fidel Castro's slogan during Cuba's special period, which is socialism and death, socialism or death, rather. Inspired by Brazil's landless workers movement, MST, they struggle for land reform, the decommodification of land, redistribution, which includes urban land, land usage for social needs. In their presence, Sabu Zikode spoke recently about democratizing the built environment and on decisions pertaining to climate policy, since shack dwellers, of course, are on the front lines of the climate catastrophe, not to mention the front lines of massive state violence. And he said, quote, "The power to allocate land and to plan for land use cannot only be exercised by the state and the rich. Democracy has to mean more than just voting every few years. It has to mean day-to-day participation in decision-making and democratic self-management." And I think that's very powerful, and I think that's true. So in the end, I go back to Neville Alexander, and what he proposed in 1992 is as relevant as ever in the face of catastrophic set of crises, economic crises, energy crises, ecological crises, housing crises, gender violence crises. And the absence of a strong social democratic labor movement, there is an urgent need just to keep people alive, just to keep people alive. And this is, I think, really critical because sometimes, I know in the United States, we're always talking about like reformist reforms versus non-reformist reforms, and what does that mean? But there's something about struggling for basic demands, social reforms that actually benefit the oppressed classes. Again, to repeat what Neville Alexander said, a living wage, houses for all, free national health service, free education for all, jobs for all, fight for the radical democratization of everyday life at every level, and internationalize the struggle, solidarity with anti-capitalist and anti-imperialist forces around the world, build Pan-African unity. And this is what socialist democracy looks like. Thank you.